What's up, everybody? Jordan Stewart here from Vover. Thanks so much for tapping into the Vover original show. Just a reminder that if you want to drop your opinions about the episode or respond to the host and guests with your voice, go and download the Vover app wherever you get your apps. Vover, voice over everything. Enjoyed the show.
It's time to level up with Dr. Mondo.
Vover.
What's good, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Level Up with Dr. Mondo. I'm your host, Dr. Armando Gonzalez, licensed therapist, coach, CEO, and founder of Cheat Code and the Cheat Code Foundation. This episode it's special to me. It's really special because there's a pretty good likelihood that you've heard of today's guest. His name is Dr. Efrem Smith. He's my pastor, one of my co-pastors at church, alongside Pastor Bob Ballion at Midtown Church. You've probably heard of him. And if you haven't, you're in for a treat. Because Dr. Smith is, in my opinion, the most prepared pastor for this moment in time, given what our country's going through with social justice and civil rights. He's a man with deep faith, but also deep knowledge and deep application on how we can integrate our faith into these troubling times with racial reconciliation. He's a leader that I follow at church. He's a leader that I'll follow as long as he continues to just be out there marching and doing what he's doing. I'm following where he's leading. And today he's my guest on the Level Up podcast. Dr. Smith, it's so good to have you, my man.
Man, it's good to be with you. I'm honored to be on this podcast. So there's just certain podcasts you just pray and hope you get to be a guest on. And so this is that one. So, man, thanks for having me.
I don't know if I can believe it, man, but if so, prayers do work. And I'm glad to have you, because I was praying that you would come on here too. I think, when I say what I just said about you and your background, can you tell some of the listeners just about how you have developed this? I don't even want to call it a niche, because it's so much of your calling and your mission, but it's around integration of the gospel of Christ into social justice, issues of justice and reconciliation. And maybe you could tell some of the listeners more about your background and how that came to be.
Sure. I'm originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so, when people think of Minneapolis, a lot of times they think of the artist Prince. And, Prince was this, very gifted, very talented, multi-ethnic person who brought different music sounds together. His own multi-ethnic, biracial background was a part of that. And so I think that growing up in Minneapolis, having that feel of an artist who was incredibly gifted, brought different genres of music together, and was multi-ethnic, multicultural himself, I think that had an impact on me. I know it did, but also I'm a product of both the African American church, but also a multi-ethnic, multiracial church in the city of Minneapolis. And so very early on, I began to wrestle with why the church, the Christian church in the United States, is so racially segregated, though it presents a message that is global and multi-ethnic. But yet it's, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said during the civil rights movement that, the most segregated hour in America is 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. And to a large degree, that is still the truth. And so, so early on, I started wrestling with issues as I got clarity on my calling, if you will, as a pastor, around issues of racial reconciliation, biblical justice, and very influenced by just reading a lot of Martin Luther King's writings, listening to his sermons. But also, I'll just end this part by, I have to say, for some reason in my office, it's like sometimes the sensor goes off if I'm not moving. So I have to and then the light comes on again. Ain't that kind of cool?
There's something you're going to incorporate into a future sermon that's analogous to that. But I'll let them save that. Yeah.
if you want the light to shine bright, you got to move. I guess
Ooh, there
that's
it is. There it is. I knew it was coming.
but my dad and my mom grew up in Jim Crow segregation. My mom's from Birmingham, Alabama, one of the epicenters of the civil rights movement.
Mm,
My dad grew up in Monroe, Louisiana. And so think about that.
yeah,
I'm the first generation in my family. I'm 51 years old to live in the post Jim Crow era,
incredible.
the post civil rights movement era. And so I think all of that played a role in my passion around issues of racial righteousness and reconciliation, as well as racial justice.
It's amazing. It reminds me of all people, my favorite author, Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, I believe it was, where he talks about just the timing and Malcolm, a lot of people don't know, is a man of faith as well, but he really paints this idea too of that, when you really step back from our histories, and especially people that really are called to leave a really big impact on the world, that had they been born even 5 years prior, or had they been born a generation later, or a neighborhood over, it's likely that their impact wouldn't have been the same. And it just shows the how much synchrony there is in those moments. I love you laying out your story in that way, because it says that, as I mentioned, I believe that you're primed for this moment to be one of the leaders in this moment, especially in the church, as we look towards racial reconciliation. But also too, it goes all the way back, as you said, to the family that you were born into. So it just shows that there's synchrony all the way around. It's amazing. Efrem Smith, Pastor Smith, Dr. Smith. I know one thing is that when we have these titles, doctor, pastor, there's often this idea that, you got it all figured out. And I think too, especially with pastors, it seems like from my perspective on the outside, there's even more pressure around pastors with this assumption that you got to have it all figured out. Like even the assumption that you probably don't go through depression, or you probably don't go through periods of self-doubt or dark nights of the soul. Like that just doesn't happen for you, because you're so protected and insulated by God from those moments. But on the contrary, I find often that when I have conversations with pastors, just like everyone, they go through those moments. So I think this is such an important episode, because you're going to give us an opportunity to get a window into what it is like for a pastor with a gigantic calling, to also show that he is also just a human and has human moments. So in your journey to leveling up, what is one singular moment that you really stands out to you now, that you think of, that you were challenged with mental health struggles, and that you were forced to face in order to continue your journey to step into your calling?
Yeah, great question. And it's great because you're so right. A lot of times faith leaders, pastors, rabbis, imams, bishops, we get painted as like, oh, you're so close to God. There must be something special about you that separates you. And I do believe that there's something about calling on pastors, but at the same time, we've seen serious scandals with faith leaders, with priests, with pastors, with rabbis, because of maybe we're not as transparent as we should be, and not as proactive about owning our own trauma. I was fortunate in my doctoral studies to take a class called Overcoming the Dark Side of Leadership. And when I
Wow.
was done with that class, I realized it was really about managing the dark side of leadership, because I don't think we fully decimate, we don't fully dismantle the dark side. That could be narcissism, compulsiveness, codependence, being paranoid, uh, uh, these dark sides, these dark traits that we don't want to own. They show up in people like me too. And
Mm,
you asked specifically about a moment for me. I think last year was traumatic for a lot of people in different ways. But after I watched the video of the death of George Floyd, um, it hit me in a deep way because he died on the block where I grew up in Minneapolis.
Wow.
And so watching George Floyd die, specifically in the neighborhood where I grew up, man, was I mean, that was a challenge for me. But also when I started to speak out, when I started to preach and teach and blog, uh, vlog, on issues of racial reconciliation and biblical justice, and even having to talk about the tough issues like systemic racism.
Mhm.
Uh, it, Man, the backlash that I received from a segment of the community known as evangelicalism.
Wow.
Oh man, the things I was called. You would have thought that that I broke the law. You would have thought that I did something illegal, that I did something scandalous for bringing up issues of systemic racism. And some of that backlash and some of the people that pushed themselves away from me, um, that I thought were a part of my inner circle, were a part of my community of support, that pushed me to a place of anxiety,
Mm.
a place of self-doubt, a place of depression, especially when you couple that with, shelter in place, with COVID and everything. But I know that there was some moments there last year where I was questioning my own call, questioning um, the things that just before that I knew that was my sweet spot. I knew that's where my gifting is. I knew that's where my calling is, to speak to these issues. I've been doing it for almost 30 years, written books on it. But yet last year, under some significant verbal attacks, um, and attacks through social media, I know that I begin to question myself and deal with a lot of self-doubt.
I'm sitting here just kind of awestruck because, I mentioned at the onset that you are my pastor. So I feel a certain type of way. Like my heart hurts to hear that. You are a friend of mine too. And I'm also just sitting here thinking like, man, I had no clue, and I'm so sorry to hear that. And it makes perfect sense because on the outside, I mean, there's a few things I didn't know. First of all, I didn't know about even the location of George Floyd's death and how that must have been traumatic for you in and of itself. Add on to the fact of being a black man, add on to the fact of then what you experience for speaking your truth out loud. Um, and I think that's something that I'm just so curious. Like, are you still struggling with that now, or have you found any peace?
I needed to spend some time. I have a spiritual director, and I'm fortunate to have people in my community like yourself, but others that are professional counselors, other pastors. I think every pastor needs a pastor. Probably
Yeah.
every therapist needs a therapist.
Oh yeah.
Every counselor needs a counselor. So I was fortunate that I was able to go to pastors, to spiritual directors, to folks that I consider mentors, to coach me through, to pastor me through, to counsel me through. You know, Fortunate that I co-pastor with another guy that you really look to, Bob Ballion, and so the fact that I had a tag team partner uh, during that journey was important. My wife and daughters. I mean, sometimes your immediate family can be the ones that they tell you the truth about yourself when you're doing wrong, but in an uplifting way, they tell you the truth about yourself when you're looking down on yourself, when you're downcast. Um, those people can give words of upliftment. So, um, and I feel like I'm at a place now where I'm finding myself again.
Mhm.
I'm coming back to me. And I think that's a journey for a lot of people, that depression, anxiety, self-doubt, these are things that can pull you from you. And so I needed the liberating journey of finding myself again.
I think to end on I wish we had 110 more minutes to fill of this time, but I want to maybe you address the future of mental health and the role that mental health ministry has in the church. I know that, our church is a part of, recently you guys committed a lot to the foundation that I run, the Cheat Code Foundation, and really doing something that is extraordinary, supporting a lot of financial commitment, but a lot of belief into basically saying that trauma informed therapies and coaching should be accessible to everyone, regardless of race, socioeconomic status. But it's a really amazing position for anyone to take, any organization, any nonprofit, but especially the church. And I'm just curious from your perspective on the topic of mental health in church. That's often been a taboo topic, right? We don't talk about that a lot in the church. From your perspective, what do you think the vision is, not only for your church, but for the church moving forward, and how it can do a better job of being open to promoting the sort of vulnerability and support that you're talking about living out in your own life?
Yeah, the church must embrace therapy, counseling, trauma-informed healing, because so much of what the Bible for Christians talks about is faith, and faith is so deeply connected to belief system. You can't talk about faith and not talk about one's belief system, because one can say they're a person of faith, but if their belief system is not healthy, is not being tended to on a regular basis, if we're not dealing with family origin issues, with when I refer to those dark side traits, if you will, then our faith can become manipulative, oppressive, not just externally but internally. And so much hinges for people of faith on the belief system, on thinking. And so this is why it's important for us to say prayer is important. Being in the scriptures is important. There's various ministries that we have, but this opportunity for a partnership with you, with Cheat Code, is a game changer for us, because it allows us the opportunity to have a more holistic, collaborative approach to growing, maturing, and being transformative in how someone lives out their faith. Because at the end of the day, we want to produce reconciling, justice-oriented, cross-cultural disciple makers that are making a difference at their schools, where they work, where they live. And so having a component of our ministry that's about healing, strengthening, and even some transformation in our thinking is so, so important.
I just thank you again for your leadership in all those ways, because you already know how I feel. I'm with you on all of it, and I'm just excited to continue to see us set the tone for what the church can and should look like. I mean, to me, at the end of the day, wherever there's a need, we should be showing up. And we know that in this country, there's a mental health crisis. And we need to, if we are truly trying to follow the life of and the example of Jesus, we need to be showing up like he did and tend to the needs of people. And this is a need. So again, this is where the church needs to be. Dr. Efrem Smith, it's been so good to spend time with you. I really appreciate your vulnerability, your honesty. Brene Brown talks about so often that we will follow leaders even further when they're willing to be courageous enough to be vulnerable. And your vulnerability, I know for me and I know for all the listeners, is going to only make us want to follow you even further than we were already planning on following you. So wherever you go, we're going. So much love for you, man. Thank you for joining us on this podcast.
Thank you for having me, man. Blessings.
All right. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Level Up with Dr. Mondo. Until next time.
It's time to level up with Dr. Mondo.